I got it wrong. We got it wrong. I was wrong about the Victorian government. In case you don't know, the Victorian government right now is demolishing Melbourne's 44 public housing towers. And for the longest time, people like me were saying that the Victorian government was demolishing and privatizing public housing without actually talking to the people who live in public housing, who live in the homes that they're flogging off to the private sector. As per the new reporting in The Age, where the Victorian government has engaged with public housing residents through the agency Redbridge. Can't believe I've done this. I can't believe I would have discredited Jacinta Allan and the Labor Party like this. The findings showed public housing tenants overwhelmingly opposed the overhaul, but Homes Victoria is nevertheless moving ahead with the government's plan to demolish the aging towers. The research conducted by Redbridge using focus groups of public housing tenants, released to the opposition through freedom of information laws after the government fought for 2 years to keep it secret, found that tenants strongly and almost unanimously rejected the government's so-called mixed tenure model. If we scroll down as well, we'll see a pathetic statement from a spokesperson for the Housing Minister, Nick Staikos, saying that the government had listened to a range of stakeholders. Well, clearly not the public housing residents that you polled. I mean, who else in this range of stakeholders will be more important than the actual people who live in the homes? Like, I just wonder who to the government is more important than public housing residents. Again, the people who live in the homes that they're privatizing and demolishing. Well, if we look at this other document that the Victorian government didn't want you to see, this meeting agenda from July 2023, so a few months before the announcements were made to demolish the public housing towers, so around the same time that the Redbridge poll was conducted. As we can see here, the people in this meeting include Director of Debt Investments at IFM, Investment Director at Infrastructure for IFM, the CEO of Super Housing Partnerships, the CEO of Aware Super Real Estate, and the Group Executive Head of Property, ISPT Property. So, Jesus, like, come on, it's not, you don't get more mask off than this. It's one thing in its own cooked way to not talk to public housing residents at all, to not engage with them whatsoever. It's another thing entirely, and I'm laughing because it is just so ridiculous. It's another thing entirely to go to public housing residents, ask what they think, and then go, nah, I don't care. Like, and instead overtly opts for the people and the companies who obviously have a vested interest in the real estate values of inner city land that are publicly owned by a government they just, so happen to be cushy with. Like, Jesus Christ, you can't get more explicit and overt like this. It's just land for this rent-seeking, parasitic web of private contractors, investment funds, developers, and community housing providers. Because those are the people and organizations who are going to benefit from public housing privatization, not the people who, again, overtly and almost unanimously said, no, we don't want this. The Victorian government just overtly is picking the side of these parasitic rent-seeking investment capitalists over the actual people who live in these communities. They get to couch it in, language of ethical consumption and community housing providers and super funds, but the profit motive is the same. The same thing is happening here if it was just a regular hedge fund and a regular landlord. The Victorian government is displacing 10,000 people, not for their sake, but for the sake of these people. It's this nexus of, again, parasitic firms, whether it be community housing providers, investment funds, developers who are corrupting housing policy in this state. There's a reason why the Victorian government is fighting so hard to keep the documents behind its decisions to demolish and privatize public housing secret, because it doesn't stack up on its own merits unless you look at it from the perspective of an investment fund. It's not fiscally, from a budget perspective, the most effective option. It's not from an urban planning perspective, the best option. It's certainly not the best option for the 10,000 people it's going to displace. The only people who are benefiting from this are those who administer this corporate black hole, which has been sucking up public assets in Victoria, but also countrywide for the last couple decades. And it gets funnier, like if we look at the Victorian government's response to the public housing inquiry that happened last year, they explicitly say here they do not support recommendation 7, which says as follows, that the Victorian government halts all work associated with the redevelopment program until it provides condition reports for each building, feasibility reports into alternatives to demolition, and the cost-benefit analysis for each site, which demonstrate evidence that demolition was the only feasible option. They don't support that. They're like, nah, don't care. Didn't ask. It doesn't matter that the evidence is against us. We're not even going to collect the evidence. We don't care. Professor David Hayward wrote a really good paper called Victoria, the Rentier Capital Estate, where he details just to what extent the Victorian government is one part of this big web of patronage of public-private partnerships and various monopolistic sectors. And clearly, the housing sector in the state is the latest victim to the rentier capital estate, whereby public policies executed not for the best interests of the people in the state, not in the best interests of the people that are most directly impacted, not even in the best interest of the public finances of the government, but for the perceived future bottom line of these companies. Completely captured, completely corrupt. And don't get me wrong, this would happen if it was a Liberal government as well. The Liberals did this shit when they were in office as well. One Nation would certainly do it if they were in office. It's just that the Victorian government has been in power for most of the last 2 decades here in Victoria, and so they're the ones who've been in charge. But anyway, if I can say something to Simon Newport for 1 second, get off your ass and do something, champion. The union is coming for you. I mentioned in the last video 40 for Refuse activity, particularly in 150 Inkerman Street in South Melbourne, and how the residents committee there that was recently elected just got their first win. And they're back at it again. They're, in the midst of a new campaign, this time around bug infestations. I'll read directly from 40 for Refuse website. The elected residents committee for 150 Inkerman Street sent a letter to Homes Victoria on the 3rd of June, demanding a systematic timeline plan of action on bug infestations. The agency stonewalled their request. And not just public housing, but community housing as well. Recently, the Renters and Housing Union has formed a resident committee at the Oasis Estate in South Melbourne, and we have sent a letter of demands to the Housing First Board because they are seeking to evict the community housing tenants there. So, Simon, if I was you, I'd lock the fuck in. Things are starting to happen. We're actually starting to, collectively organize people and seeing wins. And it's not just tenant unionism as well. We're seeing labour unions get on board with opposing public housing demolition and privatisation. Recently, the Australian Services Union, the Victorian branch, came out and just completely disavowed and condemned the Victorian government's plan to demolish and privatise public housing. No caveats, no nothing, just plain language. We don't want you to demolish and redevelop public housing and privatise public assets, not only because of the concerns for residents, but the concerns for service workers. It's not just Victoria that this is happening in, it's also happening at the Waterloo Estate at the moment in New South Wales. It's this kind of union work, this tenant organising and labour organising that's actually what's going to stop these public housing demolitions, and then also, additionally push to extend public housing. I'm telling you, we're going to see a renewal in tenant unionism and labour unionism that we haven't seen since the 1980s. And after decades of not facing collective resistance to whatever they want to do, I think, these agencies and the people that lead them have gotten a bit too comfortable. So I think it's, time to make them a bit uncomfortable.